To me, it's always like biting into a piece of chalk. And that is very typical for Bela, and it runs through all the wines and all the vintages. Like you know, it's the Chateau Bela label, and the next wine that we have made outside of Germany was Kanta. I unfortunately don't have a map for that, but it's the vineyard is situated in the Adelaide Hills. And Kanta is actually, it was because of Bela that I got to make Kanta. I was showing the first vintage of Chateau Bela in Sweden at a portfolio tasting of my importer in 2003. And I was contacted by a guy who was making wine in Italy. And he said to me, if you make wine in Eastern Europe, you must be very courageous. Wouldn't you think about doing something in Australia? I know this guy in Adelaide who imports my wine and he could help us and so on. And in 2004, I went and explored the wine regions. And to me, between all the vineyards that I've seen, it was actually Adelaide Hills that I liked best. And we've been able to work with Shaw & Smith, who in the beginning sold us the grapes and who have from the start made our wine for us like we wanted them to make it. The vineyard that we used was on the first vintages until 2009. You will see that it's labeled Balhana Vineyard, which is right, or which used to be right in front of the Shaw & Smith winery. And that was a very good setup because it was very easy to harvest, to look and have a look in the cellar and do everything at the same time. But in 2009, Shaw & Smith decided to replant the vineyard because they are much specialized in Sauvignon Blanc. And so we had to look for a new vineyard, which is up in Chunga. It's a little bit higher up in the hills, and it's very close to Ironstone Road. And the road actually gives, it refers to the soil, which is ironstone and shale. So when you really look at it, it's very similar to slate, very similar to the soil that we have here in Germany, and in the vineyard that we are using, that we are buying the grapes from now, they have 3 blocks with Riesling. 2 are more or less on soil, and the third one is more or less on rock, on the slate, on the shale. And that is the one that we prefer, that we like to get our grapes from whenever we can. And it was very young when we started to use the grapes, but now after 10 years, they seem to be, the wines seem to be coming of age, and I find that slowly but surely they're getting better. Also in Australia, we're trying to make a dry wine because in Australia Riesling has to be dry, and we want to play by the rules. We do some things a little bit differently from what other growers in Australia do. We harvest the grapes when they are really ripe and not just when there's enough sugar. So generally a little bit later than other growers. Then we do, most of the time, we do a little bit of skin contact, which I don't do in Germany, but in Australia, I seem to find that you get more flavor in the skin than in the juice, whereas, for instance, here there is more flavor in the juice and there's no need to extract flavor from the skin. So in Australia, we try to have a few hours of skin contact, and then, very importantly, we don't protect the press or the juice from oxidation. I guess in Australia, it's general practice to press under nitrogen, and at least for white wines, and to keep them as free of oxidation as possible. But we let the oxidation happen, and then the wine is fermented with its own yeast, and that's it. So it's very simple. I came back from Australia from the harvest just before the lockdown, and I guess by now they might already be ready to bottle. Now, what we are best known for, of course, is Schachzow, which you can see. I'm just sitting inside. It's my home and my winery, and we've been there for a little bit more than 200 years. The Schachzow estate used to be a property of a monastery in Trier, which was seized and sold in after the French Revolution. And at that time, my great-great-great-grandfather, who used to be one of the monks in the monastery, bought the estate, and we've been there ever since. And when he died, it was divided between his 7 children, and that is why nowadays there are several owners in the Schachzowberg. Here you can see where we are situated, very close to Luxembourg, for a wine region pretty far north, and what I believe to be very important, very close to the sea, or at least not very far from the sea. This is Hugh Johnson's map of the Saar region, which I think is it's many years old, but nobody has ever done a better representation of the vineyards here, because you can not only see where the vineyards are, but also how they are, how the exposition is, how steep they are. So it's really very, very useful. And Schachzow is between Wiltingen and Oberemmel. You can see it south-facing vineyard. Well, didn't want to do that. Go back. South-facing vineyard, not facing the river, quite far off the river actually, and altogether 28 hectares. I own 8.5 hectares out of the 28, and there are 7 other owners. The next big chunk of vineyards that we have is Wiltinger Braune Kupp, which is actually, you can see it if you follow the Saar River from Wiltingen north, and where it makes the 180-degree turn, that is where Wiltinger Braune Kupp is. So this vineyard is right on the river, and therefore has a much warmer microclimate, because of course it has the influence of the river, and it's much lower in altitude. And you can see it on this map. It's protected from both sides, from west and east, and so it's probably one of the warmest places in the region. And then we have another fairly big vineyard of 1.5 hectares in Saarburg, which is, you can see it if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the vineyard. You have the city of Saarburg, and Saarburger Rausch is just, it's last vineyard on the left. Then we have a couple of plots here and there in Oberemmler-Rosenberg, which is right next east of Schachtshofberg, and Wiltinger Braunfels, which is right next the same hill, but right next west to the Schachtshofberg. And altogether, we now have 16.5 hectares of vineyards. Wiltinger Braune Kupp and Schachtshofberg are bottled under the vineyard name because we think that these are our best and most valuable sites, and all the other vineyards are used to make the Schachtshof. Schachtshof is our entry-level wine. I'll talk about that later, but they're not; those vineyards are not bottled under the vineyard name. It is it's much older. It is the vineyard class. It was a Prussian vineyard classification, and compared to the map we've seen before, this one is turned maybe 45 degrees. So it's you'd have to turn it left 45 degrees to have it in the same direction as the other one. And of course, it's larger. It covers all the way until the city of Trier. But the big bright red plot at the left bottom is Schachtshofberg, and you can see that already in those days, 170 years ago or so, it was considered to be extremely valuable because the red plots are the ones that were most highly rated, and the rating has been done by the tax authorities. So not so much based on the wine quality, but on the potential of making money. This is from the opposite side of Schachtshof. So if you climb, it's a very narrow valley actually. And if you climb the hill on the other side and go to the top, here, this is about 500 meters in altitude. And you can see the Schachtshofberg, how it is exposed and how it looks in total perspective. It's you can probably see that it's not quite even. It undulates a little bit, but it's fairly steep, and it is actually quite high. Soil is slate, and this is how slate looks in the subsoil. You have layers. Actually, these are sediments that have been compressed by water and over the years have hardened, and then by seismic movements have been turned upside down, and then water started to seep inside. With frost, they were broken up, and that's how the soil started to build. And here you can see how it looks. This is at the top of the Schachtshofberg. So this is a typical gray slate, but you can see that even here you have some pieces of red which indicate iron, and they are all, it's not just one single color. There's a lot of different stuff in here. One of our old vineyards, we are very proud of these. Actually, until last year, we had about 3 hectares of vineyards that were planted before phylloxera between 1895 and 1905. And this plot we had to uproot last year because it was infested with phylloxera. It was infested for some time, but for some time it was more or less coping, and then since 2014 we had hot and dry summers, and it was we could watch the vineyard losing vigor. The wines were dying, and finally, after the 2019 vintage, we said we have to uproot it, we have to replant it. And now we are waiting because there's no real means against phylloxera, and the only thing that works is to just to wait until it goes away. So this vineyard, for the time being, is not planted, and it's about 8,500 square meters. So we are left with only a little bit more than 2 hectares of these old wines. This is the other one. Traditional Mosel trellising, as you can see. If you look at the grapes, you can see that this is summertime. It's long before variation, between flower and variation. The grapes are already starting to form, but they're not ripe yet. And you can see that there is no wire trellis. We have one stake with each wine, and the shoots are attached to the stakes by hand, which is quite time consuming, and it's much easier to push everything into the wire trellis and let it grow. But in the old vineyards, unfortunately, that's not possible. And it's also not possible to refit them with wire trellis, because they are planted 1 meter by 1 meter. And if we put in wire trellis, there would be much more foliage and much less air. And we probably have fungus pressures that would be too high. And that's why in the old vineyards we keep the old system. Harvest time, the grapes are hand harvested, carried down the vineyards by men, young, strong men. This picture is from the 1980s, so the ladies have all retired since, but the guy is still working, and he's from Poland, and every year he comes for harvest. And 2005.
Egon, we can't hear you. Something happened. I don't know what happened, but something happened. We can't hear you. Now we can. Now we can.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is it okay?
Yes, perfect. Yes, perfect. Very good.
Okay. This is 2005 vintage botrytis grapes. You can see that they are never uniform. You have some green grapes that are not affected at all. You have other grapes that have just been affected that are still round, and then grapes in various stages of shriveling, and that is what we have to work with in such years. So we do, if the weather allows us, if the weather permits, and if we have sufficient time, and then we do selective harvesting. And you can see the pickers have 2 buckets. At this stage, they would be told to only take the bunches that have a lot of botrytis grapes, and from those bunches, pluck the shriveled grapes, put them into the small bin, and the rest goes into the big bin. The healthier grapes will remain on the wine and will be picked in a second pass. That's me checking that everything is all right. So this is how the grapes should look before botrytis. And this is, I believe, from the 2016 vintage, where we had barely any botrytis grapes. This is 2016 Cabinet Alte Reben. The photo was taken, if I remember correctly, on the 20th of October. We had been picking for a couple of weeks all the QBA grapes, cabinet grapes, and after that we stopped picking entirely until 3rd or 4th of November, and then we were hoping for more botrytis, which did not really come. And then in November we finished the harvest, and what we harvested at that time became Spätlese. But here you can have an idea of how grapes for very good cabinet would look. We drive the grapes to the winery. You've seen our trailer before, on the picture before. There are 3 bins, and the 3 bins hold about 1.5 tons. And our presses are geared to hold 1.5 tons, and that would give us about 1 cask. These are the foeder casks the wines are made in. So from the vineyard we can control the pressing, because when we send the trailer off, we know it's going to be 1 press and it's going to be 1 cask. And the grapes are pressed immediately. So if we pick everything, if we don't slow ourselves down doing selective pickings, the first trailer would arrive at the winery. We'd start picking at 8:30 in the morning, and around 10:30 the first trailer would arrive to the winery, and by the time the next one arrives, the first pressing is already finished, and so the grapes can be handled directly and immediately. This is something, of course, that's 2016 vintage, which was in many ways unusual, but it gives you an idea about our climate, about rainfall. You can see, of course, the highest temperatures are in summer, but they are never extremely hot. And the very interesting thing here is the red curve on the rainfall chart, which shows you that in general we have very, very evenly distributed rainfall. And to come back to our phylloxera thing, I believe that's the reason why in our vineyards, phylloxera, the wines have been able to withstand phylloxera for such a long time. A, of course, because we were not overcropping them. B, because the soils have a lot of organic matter, which gives a lot of nutrients. And C, there's always water. There's no real dry season in our region. And that's why, as the summers seem to be becoming drier and drier, it will be more and more difficult to maintain these old vineyards. As a contrast, here's 2015, which is 2015 is one of the true classic vintages. And here the interesting thing is rainfall in September, which was, you can see that there's all year long it was very dry, and then in September and there was a lot of rain, and then right afterwards during harvest it was very dry. So that September rain triggered botrytis, and also the fact that it was colder in, you see that in August and September the temperature dropped below normal levels, and so we had botrytis and the acidity stayed high, and that's why 2015 is one of the really classic vintages. Schachzow, you know the label. I can show you the bottle if you want. Cabinet. That's how it looked in the 1960s before the land reorganization. Okay. And now, what can I do for you? Any questions?
All right. Well, then let's start to do one by one some questions, guys, ladies. Fire away. Anybody? Nobody dares to ask a question? You can unmute your microphone, those who want to ask a question.
Yeah, can I?
Yes, go ahead, I know.
I've got a question. Thank you very much for the presentation. I've got a question. What is your next project? What is your 2020, 2021? What is on your mind? What do you want to do?
Well, right now I'm sitting on my hands and I'm waiting for the crisis to go away.
Yeah, aren't we all? We're all doing the same.
But it's the vineyard work goes on.
Because I've never heard about the law, such as
The law.
no, I fell down.
What do you mean? What law? Nicolo, did you ask a question?
No.
No, okay. All right, sorry.
The vineyards are growing. It's the weather has been very nice. Everything is very early, and so we are afraid we won't have our usual seasonal crew this year, and so we are a little bit nervous.
So what can you do if the Polish can't come?
Well, go to the vineyard myself.
Well, I guess no choice.
Sorry, I felt. Did you hear the question?
No, we didn't hear any question.
Okay, so you've mentioned in Australia Riesling must be dry. That was right in the beginning of the presentation. Is it general expectation of people to have it dry, or is it somehow locked in the law? Because I've never heard.
No. There's no law. It's just that people in Australia expect Riesling to be dry, and even more than today. That was the case in 2005 when we started. Nowadays there are a few wineries who are marketing off dry and sweet Riesling, but in 2005 a wine like that would have been almost impossible to sell. And when you see the Australian system of trade shows where the wines are judged by judges who've been trained by their fellow judges for a long time, and you see that, for instance, Riesling to win a medal has to be something along the lines of 12.5% of alcohol, 7.5 grams of acidity, bone dry, and if it doesn't fit these specifications, then it may be a great wine, but it probably won't win a medal.
Okay, understand. How is your approach generally to the viticulture? Because obviously you're working with 3 different locations, and specifically about canopy and shading the grapes. I'm wondering if you're approaching more or less to the viticulture the same, and you're just adjusting bits and pieces towards to the local climate, or is it something that you needed to completely sort of restructure your approach to the Riesling in every different country?
Well, in Slovakia and in Australia, I found situations that were already there. And for one reason or another, we've never been able in any of those 2 countries to establish our own vineyards. It's possible that in Slovakia we get there now. but I'll only believe it when I see it. And I would do things differently, but so far I've not been able to do it.
Okay. Okay. Well, another can I just give you a couple of questions? Is it okay?
Yeah, for me it's okay.
Yeah. Another questions is generally there's a lots of research going on. The times has changed since 80s. We are having more understanding. We can read the wine a little bit more. We can explain it scientifically. Is it something that is in your interest? The approaches from the old world and the new world is still slightly different. In new world, they would do very much precision viticulture, such as maybe in Australia, where they would just pick up the specific plots. They would blend the wine together as a hierarchy. But I'm wondering, how is it for you and being in this business for a certain time, and how generally you are looking at the scientific approaches? Is it something that really interests you? Is it something that you apply, or is you rather stick with sort of being in the vineyard, see it, and having a bit more sort of human approach, I would say?
Well, that was actually what interested me, what made me go to Australia. This different approach, but I think that since 2005, in 2005 it was probably still, as you describe it, very much the winemaker's approach to the vineyard and to the wine. Creating something that the winemaker had imagined. Whereas in Europe, of course, when you are fortunate to own one of the old famous vineyard sites, you are really blocked in, and you cannot just go ahead and make something completely different. And that was what interested me in going to Australia in the first place. But I think that both the European approach and the Australian approach have changed since.
Okay. Do you think it's more blending together now? It's almost like they are getting bits and pieces that are just...
Well, I think that in Europe you see more science. Unless you go to small handcrafted wineries, you definitely see more high-end machinery, and they are embracing technology more than 15 years ago. And in Australia, there is more of an approach to, well, there's more of trying to understand the vineyards.
Okay.
So I think it's coming together.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Questions, please. It's your opportunity.
Yeah, Egon, last time we had the pleasure to meet. You were telling me you were looking to do a drier Riesling in Moselle as well. Is it still something that is a project which is going on?
No, not in the Moselle. That's here in my own place. We tried to make a dry wine from Schachthofberg in the Saar, and we had some grapes that were especially selected from the 2018 vintage, because we found that 2018 was a year that was more than usually suitable for making dry wines. But finally, we said we are going to make a high-end dry wine from it. But if we make a high-end wine, it has to be very good. And we did not like the result so much as to put it out under our name. So if you want to know what we did with it, we put it into the 2019 QBA.
Okay,
Good.
good to know.
But before your father, or maybe during your father, did the estate produce much white wine? Dry white wine, I mean, dry.
Well, it's not really. I guess in the old days, say before Second World War, I assume that there was a lot of dry wine because it was not always possible to stop the fermentation just as one wanted, and then it was also very difficult to bottle sweet wines and be sure that they would not ferment in the bottle. And then after the Second World War, it was we had better means of filtration, better understanding of sterile bottling, and so it became universally possible to bottle sweet wine. And for some time, I would say that almost 100% of our production was more or less sweet. But in the 1970s, there was a demand for drier wines. And I think from 1975 onwards, my father produced a couple of casks of dry wines every year until 98. 98 was the last year we made a dry wine, and then I stopped it.
Okay, 98. And did you sell these wines as well, or was it like?
No, we sold them, of course. If you in 1990, 91, if you wanted to sell wine in a German restaurant, it had to be dry. Otherwise, you could not be considered a serious producer.
Interesting. So, any more
May I
questions?
ask you how come? If I'm not mistaken, still until 70s or 80s, there was Liebfraumilch quite widely consumed. Am I correct? So that would just give quite a lot of sweet palate. What changed over that? Just like a bit of the decade or over the decade, where suddenly everybody wanted to come. Was it something that VDP started to be very active around?
No. That had nothing to do with VDP. You must imagine that there was the Liebfraumilch kind of wines, and it was not only Liebfraumilch. There was
Blue Nun,
Liebfraum, Blue Nun, Black Tower, you name it. They were made from generally bulk wines and in large quantities. So they were at the complete opposite of the spectrum, the quality spectrum. That was a trade wine. It's like if you go to Bordeaux, you have say Bordeaux Rouge from one of the great negociant houses, and it's a completely different wine than Chateau Lafite. But what most of the people drink is the supermarket negociant wine. And the same thing was true in Germany. Actually, some of the people, like the owners of Blue Nun, the Sichel family, they had a catalog with fine German estate wines that they were selling with their Blue Nun. The same for the Reh family, who were the producers of Black Tower. They were also selling some of the. No, at that time it was still Kindermann. Kindermann was the producer of Black Tower, and they were having a fine wine catalog that was in the US market. That was the Bible. If you were not in that catalog as a producer, you were nobody.
Thank you.
I got a question, Egon, if it's possible. I would like to know, in terms of vinification and maturation, the steps are actually the same for all of your wine, and even the one which come from between Brown Cooper or Schwarzhof, or always something is changed between?
No, in here in the Saar, all the grapes are treated the same. The only difference is that in a year like 2016, when there's little or no botrytis, the grapes will be crushed. And when we have a lot of botrytis, they will go to the press directly without crushing. And in Slovakia, it's pretty much the same system. But in Australia, we try to have a little bit more skin contact.
And in terms of maturation, because in the picture that we saw before was like a wood barrel where the wine is better fermenting, and then
well, we use wood barrels for all the vineyard designated wines. Okay. And as a rule of thumb, Schwarzhof goes into stainless steel tanks. And in Bela and for Canter, it's stainless steel. And the wood that we use, the barrels are old. We don't want them for the taste of the wood. We only want them for the physical properties of the wood. Micro-oxygenation, you could call it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Egon?
Yes.
Yes. When was the first big foeder that you have bought in your life? I know you took over the estate from your dad in '89, I think, and but when was the first time that you bought?
Well, there was a time. I think until the late '90s, you could buy used casks from other growers for a song, and good casks. And we bought a lot of those. And then after 2000, people seemed to go back to winemaking in casks again, and the supply dried up. So in '98, I had to buy the first new casks, and they are from Slovenia. And normally we like to think that a cask with proper care should last for 50 years or something. But these are already starting to fall apart.
Oh my God, okay.
We've just turned 3 of them into flower pots.
Wow. And where did the oak come from in the old ones? German or French?
Well, it's local here around the Mosel. In the hills, there's a lot of forest and there's a lot of oak trees. And when you talk to the foresters, they like to tell you how many of their best oak trunks go to France.
Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, that's like the Hungarian foie gras made in France. Fair enough. Yeah. Anyone? More questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes, I would like to ask you something. Sorry, I interrupt. If you, for the weather side, that is gonna be maybe too hot with the changing and everything, you never think to use red grape to blending the Riesling?
To blend?
to blend the Riesling in order to have the same flavor profile. I don't know.
No, of course I'm thinking, but so far I think that we are still calling the hot vintages our great vintages. For instance, we are in 2019. We had some record temperatures in July, the highest temperatures ever recorded, and we are very happy with the wines. 2015 would be considered to be a hot vintage. 17, 18, all the great years are really hot vintages, and as long as that is the case, I think that we are still better off sticking with what we can do than trying to find something else. But of course, I'm looking and I'm watching and I'm trying to follow what others do with Pinot Noir, for instance.
Thank you.
Well, you pretty much answered the Pinot Noir questions, because I wanted to ask you how much is it in the interest. Obviously, the Spätburgunder that is produced in Germany is absolutely outstanding, and being more and more targeted by the wine collectors and more set up in the blind tasting. I actually have a question: if you ever work with concrete vats, and how the concrete vats have an effect on Riesling, if you have any experience with that.
Well, we used to have concrete vats in the 60s. Before we had the stainless steel vats, but they were glass lined, and we've not been very happy with them. For some time I've always been thinking about getting one of these eggs. Just to try it out, but the problem that we knew about with the old concrete tanks is that when you had a broken glass and the wine would be in contact with the concrete, because of the acidity in the Riesling, it would the calcium in the concrete would more or less de-acidify the Riesling. And that was something that was that has always prevented me from getting an egg. But I'd still take one if I could get it.
Thank you.
I have a question. It's more about regarding sommelier job. How would you sell your Riesling to a guest, for example?
Egon doesn't know how to sell.
No, I have no idea.
So that's not a question you should ask him. You ask him how to drink his Riesling in a restaurant. That he can answer very easily. I think that the Egon Muller, to sell Egon Muller Riesling, thankfully nowadays has gotten to a point where those who know, and think that they're happy to drink it. So, at the end of the day, I think that your question probably might be asked in a way that, because in Egon's repertoire of wines, the cabinet would qualify, if you want, as a dry wine. I know it's not dry wine, but it is basically would be the one that would be the dry wine, even with the Cuvier as well. And try to explain that to people when they drink it, that it actually does have residual sugar in there, but the acidity is so high that actually the sensation in the mouth remains to be dry at the end. So that's, I think this is where the challenge lies for a sommelier, where you have some people who have preconceived ideas, and as soon as they say, "Oh, sweet Riesling," no, I don't want sweet Riesling, and that's where you need to surpass the hurdle. But I have to say that I met many hardcore people who have changed their minds once they taste the product. And it's, again, you guys are the masters of food and wine matching. You put it with a plate, the particular product will work very well. So I think that's more the approach that you need to take, in my opinion. So
thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Walter.
Hi, Walter.
Hi, hello. I'm working in La Dame de Vic. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Egon, for your representation. Was really, really interesting. I just want to ask you, which is your your best vintage for Charson? I know the best vintage for you is the hot vintage, but Is there?
No. The best vintage is always the one that I'm selling. That's what I've learned when I was working in Bordeaux. No, it's hard to tell because we had some really great vintages recently. 15, 17. These are fantastic years, but I wouldn't touch them. I would not drink them because with both. I know that they will be much better in 20, 30, 40 years time. And on the other hand, you have things like 18, which is drinking. You start a bottle of 18 Schachzhof and you cannot finish it. You cannot open the next one quickly enough before you have finished it. And 16 is the same. They're drinking so well. They're maybe not as age-worthy, not as great, but it's just purely drinkable wines. And so it's, I mean, if we talk about old vintages, then it becomes easier because when you say 75 or 76, is 75 better than 76? I can say yes, because both are at their peak now, and it's you're not talking about something that has yet to be merited.
Okay, thank you very much. Get the point.
And also, I think there's a point to be made when Egon mentions the fact that it is not as age-worthy. We're still talking 20 years plus, okay, just to be clear. So it's not like, oh my God, what happens in the next 7 to 8 years? These are wines that can easily age 20 years, no problem.
No, that is not the question. 20 years is nothing.
I know, well, that's what I'm saying, but you need to put this into context. Because for a lot of people, when you say it's not age-worthy, they are like, oh, you need to drink it in the next 5 years. We're talking here, 20, 30, 40 years. That's what we're talking about. So.
Yeah. Well, take years. 2002 comes to mind. It's big vintage, some rain during harvest, so there was a little bit of fear of dilution, and many people said this is not going to age, but the wines are drinking quite well now. And actually, I just had 2002 Spätlese next to 2001 Spätlese, and 2001 is a hyped year, but 2002 right now is drinking much better.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that it's also interesting because if you look at like really, really hard and difficult vintages like 2013, which initially for the first 2 years, 3 years of its life was virtually impossible to drink because the acidity was so high and the wine didn't settle. But even if you drink today, 2013 QBA is unbelievable. I mean, the wine is already now fantastic. Yes, it doesn't have 2018, but it has a higher acidity. Yes, it's a leaner wine, but the wine settled down incredibly well and drinks fantastically well.
Well, but that is what you get. 13 is in the context of recent vintages. It's really the reminder of what we were doing in the 1980s. And I think I've told you at one point that if we had 2013 in the 1980s, we would have said, wow, great vintage.
Yeah, exactly.
But in those days, the wines were like that. And they came onto the market and they were hard to drink. And that was one of the reasons why people had such a hard time with Riesling.
And global warming benefits.
Yeah, global warming. Thanks for global warming.
Exactly. So, any more questions? All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, then I would like to thank all the participants who joined and Egon for this. And guys, stay safe, ladies as well. And we'll see you at the next one.